Welcome to Caledonia Sleeps, your peaceful escape into the heart of Scotland. Tonight, we're going somewhere most people have never thought to look, into the darkest corner of Scotland's fairy story. So settle in, pull the covers close, let the room go quiet around you. If these stories mean something to you, a like and a subscribe helps more people find their way to the fireside. And make sure to add a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from tonight. Outside it is late May in the lowlands of Scotland, and the sky above the Firth of Forth is the colour of a bruised plum, the last light draining away behind the hills to the west. The hawthorn is in full blossom. The air smells of rain and turned earth and something older than both. Tonight's story begins with the fairies. Not the fairies of children's stories, not the pretty winged creatures of greeting cards and garden ornaments. We have spoken before about the real fairy folk of Scotland, the Sidhe, the Good Neighbours, the beings who lived in the hills and under the water and along the margins of the world that humans thought they owned. We have talked about the Seelie and Unseelie courts. We know what iron means and rowan, and why you never take wood from a fairy hill. That ground has been walked. But there is another layer to the fairy story, a darker one that has nothing to do with the creatures themselves, and everything to do with what happened to the people who believed in them. Because in Scotland, for a period of roughly 170 years, believing in the fairies could get you killed. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. I mean that men and women, healers, midwives, wandering folk doctors, ordinary crofting people, were arrested, tried, and burned alive, in part because they admitted, openly and sincerely, that they had met the fairy folk, that they had been gifted healing knowledge by the Good Neighbours, that they had danced in the fairy hills, or spoken with the Queen of Elfheim, or received small flint arrowheads from the hands of the fairy people themselves. They did not think of themselves as witches. They did not believe they were doing anything wrong. And that, perhaps, is the most heartbreaking part of all. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to the world that existed before the year 1560, before the Reformation swept through Scotland and changed with extraordinary speed almost everything about how ordinary people were expected to live and believe and make sense of misfortune. In that older Scotland, the Catholic Scotland that stretched back through the medieval centuries, folk belief and formal religion existed in a kind of uneasy, mostly workable companionship. The Church had its saints and its sacraments, and its Latin masses, its priests and its holy water, and alongside all of that, barely separated from it in the minds of most ordinary people, ran the older current, the one that had been there before Christianity arrived. The belief in the good neighbours, the fairy folk, the ones who lived close and whose goodwill needed to be maintained. In every parish, in every glen, in every fishing village along the long Scottish coastline, there were people who acted as go-betweens, the cunning folk, the fairy doctors, men and women who were known to have a particular relationship with the other world, and who used that relationship to help their communities. They found lost cattle, they healed sick children, they lifted curses from churns that would not make butter. They knew, or claimed to know, which herbs would draw out a fever, and which words spoken over a newborn would keep it safe through the night. Their methods were not those of university-trained physicians, of course. There were no university-trained physicians available to a crofting family in Ayrshire or a fishing community in Fife. What there was the woman at the end of the village who knew things, who had been taught, she might tell you in a low voice, by the good neighbours, who had received her knowledge from a fairy man she had met at a certain ford, or a certain standing stone, on a night when the boundary between the worlds grew thin. The Catholic Church did not entirely approve of this. The Church, in theory, regarded all magic outside its own sacramental system as suspect. But there was a distinction, quietly observed in practice, between harmful magic, the kind used to curse an enemy, to cause illness, to spoil crops, and helpful magic, the kind used to heal and protect. That distinction mattered. It was the difference between a cunning woman offering a charm to a worried mother and a witch sending sickness into a neighbour's byre. It was not a perfect distinction. It was not a clean one, but it existed, and as long as it existed, the people who claimed fairy contact as a source of their healing gifts occupied an uncertain but survivable space in their communities. That space closed in 1560. It closed with extraordinary swiftness and extraordinary violence, and the people who lost their lives as a result were, in many cases, not even fully aware of what had changed or why. They went on doing what they had always done, going out to meet the good neighbours at the ford, keeping faith with the old relationships, using the old knowledge to help their neighbours. And one day, without warning, what had been tolerated became a hanging offence. What had been lived alongside for generations became evidence of a pact with the devil. And the fairy hills, which had always been mysterious and something dangerous, but also the source of great gifts, became in the eyes of the new authorities something else entirely. They became evidence, that was all. Something that had been ancient and complex and genuinely dangerous in its own right was flattened, in the space of a generation, into a single word: devil. On the 4th of June, 1563, The Scottish Parliament passed a law. It was brief, it was blunt, and it would result in the deaths of somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 people over the next 173 years. The Act, known formally as Anentis Witchcraftus, concerning witchcrafts, made it a capital offence for anyone to practice or even to consult with witches, sorcerers, or necromancers. The penalty was death, not imprisonment, not exile, death. The Act came 3 years after the Protestant Reformation of 1560, and it cannot be separated from the context. The reformers who had overthrown the Catholic Church in Scotland were determined to build a new, godly society, one stripped of what they called vain superstition. That phrase covered a great deal of ground. It covered Catholic practices like praying to saints and venerating relics. But it also covered something much older and much more embedded in everyday Scottish life. The entire world of folk belief, the charmers, the healers, the people who talked to the good neighbours. Before the Reformation, as we have said, there had been a working distinction between harmful and helpful magic. The Protestant Kirk swept that distinction away entirely. In the new theological order, there was no such thing as benign magic. If your healing power did not come from God, verifiably, scripturally, through prayer and scripture alone, then it came from somewhere else, and that somewhere else had only one name: the devil. It did not matter that the woman who healed your child had never considered herself in league with any such thing. It did not matter that she had called on Breed or the saints or the good neighbours or the ancient blessing words her grandmother had taught her. In the eyes of the Kirk and the new courts, all of it was the same. The fairy folk who had given her knowledge were the devil's instruments. The Queen of Elfhame, who appeared to her in the hill, was the devil in disguise. Every cure she had performed, every charm she had spoken, every lost cow she had found, all of it was evidence not of her gift, but of her corruption. The numbers are sobering. Between 1563 and 1736, approximately 3,837 people are known to have been formally accused of witchcraft in Scotland. Historians estimate that somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 were executed, strangled and burned in the standard Scottish method. Around 85% of those accused were women. Scotland prosecuted its people for witchcraft at a rate that far exceeded its European neighbours. Proportional to its population, the number of executions here was among the highest in all of Europe. This was not simply superstition running wild. It was a legal and theological framework, carefully constructed and actively enforced, designed to eliminate an entire layer of folk life that the new church found intolerable. And woven through the records of those trials, appearing again and again in the testimonies of the accused are the fairies, the good neighbours, the people of the hills, people who had lived in the imagination and experience of ordinary Scots alongside them for centuries. The court of Elfheim was about to become the most dangerous place in Scotland. The first case I want to bring you dates to 1576, 13 years after the Witchcraft Act was passed, long enough for its existence to have become known, but perhaps not long enough for its full reach to have been understood by everyone it would eventually touch. Her name was Bessie Dunlop. She lived in Dalry in Ayrshire, on the southwestern edges of Scotland, where the hills roll down toward the Firth. She was a wife, a mother, a midwife, a woman her neighbours came to when they were sick, when their animals were ailing, when things had gone wrong in ways they could not explain. She was, by all accounts, a woman of some local standing, not wealthy, not educated in any formal sense, but trusted, known to have a gift. Her gift, she said, came from a man called Tom Reid. Tom Reid had been a soldier. He had died at the Battle of Pinkie in 1547, the last pitched battle between the independent kingdoms of Scotland and England, fought on a September morning on the plain east of Edinburgh. He had fallen there with thousands of others, and yet, Bessie said, he came to her. Not long after her own child died, and her husband fell sick, and she herself was weak and grieving and walking one day between her house and the Moot Castle yard, weeping to herself in the road. He appeared to her there, in the lane, quietly without drama. She knew him. She had known him in life. He told her that he now moved among the fairy court, that 12 of the good neighbours and their people had passed through this same road not long before, and that he had leave to walk with her a little while. He taught her. He came to her again and again over the years that followed, and through him she learned which herbs would lift a fever, which charms would protect a newborn, which words would ease a dying person's passage. She refused, she was careful to say, to give up her Christian faith. Tom in the fairy court pressed her on this. When a company of the good neighbours came to her door, 8 women and 4 men, she said, well dressed, whom Tom called the good wights. They tried to persuade her to join them fully. She would not. She remained in her own understanding, a Christian woman who happened to have been taught healing by a man who now dwelt among the fairy folk. This distinction saved her nothing. She was arrested in 1576. Her confession was extracted using a method known as waking, sleep deprivation, maintained over days until the mind surrenders its resistance and tells the interrogators whatever they wish to hear. On the 8th of November of that year, before the High Court of Justiciary at Dalkeith, Bessie Dunlop was found guilty of sorcery and witchcraft. The sentence was strangling, followed by burning. Her age at death is nowhere recorded. She had healed, as far as anyone could record, only those who came to her for help. She had harmed no one. She was executed because she said she had met the fairy folk, and because in the Scotland of 1576, that admission was enough. The scholar Lisanne Henderson, writing about Bessie's case, notes that what makes her testimony so remarkable is not its strangeness, but its ordinariness. She was not the only woman in Ayrshire who spoke of meeting the good neighbours. She was simply the one who was caught. You can still drive through Dalry today. The hills are the same hills. The road between the houses is still there, and somewhere in the record of an autumn day in 1576, a woman who only wanted to help people was taken out and killed for it. Sometime around 1583, the most powerful churchman in Scotland was dying. Patrick Adamson, Archbishop of St Andrews, was gravely ill, a wasting, mysterious sickness that his own physicians, trained men with university degrees and Latin texts, had tried everything to cure and failed. He had influence at the court of James VI. He had enemies in the kirk who wanted him destroyed. He had learning, authority, and position, and he had quietly, in some pragmatic corner of his mind that his theology perhaps could not fully account for, sent for a woman from Byrehill. Her name was Alison Pearson. She was a healer from a small settlement near St Andrews in the Kingdom of Fife, where the grey North Sea light falls flat across the farmland, and the town's great cathedral ruins stand against the sky. Her guide in the healing arts was her uncle, William Simpson, a man who had died and who now moved among the fairy court, and who came back to her when she needed him, bringing with him the knowledge of herbs and remedies that he had learned among the good neighbours. Through him she could heal things that no living physician understood. She cured the Archbishop fully and completely. He recovered, returned to public life, was posted the following year as Scottish ambassador to the court of Elizabeth I of England. And here is where Alison's story takes its particular dreadful turn, because Adamson was a man with many enemies. The factional politics of Reformation Scotland were vicious. Presbyterian against Episcopalian, Reformers against the Old Guard, Power Bloc against Power Bloc. His enemies did not need much. The fact that the Archbishop of St Andrews, the most senior churchman in the country, had been cured by a woman who openly described travelling to the fairy court, that was more than enough. A sharp political satire was written about the affair by the ballad maker Robert Semple in 1583. A wide-ranging attack on Adamson's character and conduct that included among its many charges a description of Alison riding with the fairy host on Halloween, carrying stolen goods to Elfland. The ballad named her explicitly. It fixed her in the public record, not as a healer who had saved a man's life, but as a woman consorting with supernatural forces. Her fairy contact, the thing that had given her the knowledge to succeed where trained physicians had failed, was now in print, evidence of her corruption. She was arrested, held in St Andrew's Castle, and here the story takes another strange turn. Adamson, it seems, helped her escape, whether from genuine gratitude or from fear that her trial might draw attention to what he had done in seeking her out. He appears to have arranged for her release. She vanished from the record for 5 years, but in 1588 she was taken again. This time there was no castle, no friendly intervention, no door left quietly unlocked. She was tried, convicted, and burned. The archbishop she had cured was not among those who spoke for her. He had his own catastrophes by then, excommunicated, disgraced, stripped of his revenues by the king's new favourite. He died 4 years later, supported by charity, having outlived his usefulness to everyone including himself. Whether he thought of Alison Pearson in those last years is not recorded. What her case shows us, that Bessie Dunlop's does not, is that fairy belief was dangerous, not just for the obscure and the powerless. It could become a weapon in the hands of people who had no interest in fairies whatsoever, political enemies, factional rivals, men who needed a charge that would stick. Alison Pearson's gift had been real enough to cure a dying archbishop. That same reality was precisely what made her impossible to defend. By the autumn of 1597, Scotland was deep in the third of its great witch panics. Aberdeen was at its centre. The panic had begun in February of that year, spread through the city and its surrounding parishes like smoke, fed on accusation and counter-accusation, until the executioner, William Dunn, who was paid for his services by the Borough Council, had burned an unusual number of people and been paid off in September. The records show the payment for materials: 20 pieces of peat, 4 tar barrels, a length of rope. And then, just as the panic seemed to have burned itself out, one more person was arrested. In October 1597, an old man, a wandering folk healer from Rathvin, in what is now Moray, on the edge of the Highlands, where Gaelic and Scots still met and mingled. His name was Andro Man. He was approximately 70 years old. He had been a healer and a charmer all his adult life, moving from place to place, curing sick animals and sick people with methods he made no secret of. He placed charm stones in the corners of fields to protect the crops. He passed sick patients 9 times forward through a hank of undyed yarn, and then passed a cat 9 times backward through the same yarn, transferring the illness to the animal. He could read palms. He could keep cattle from straying, by dipping a plough iron in salmon water. He was known throughout the region as a man of unusual gifts. At his trial in January 1598, Andro Man described the source of those gifts in extraordinary detail. His confession is one of the most complete documents to survive from the Aberdeen panic. One historian has called it a portal into a world of belief that has otherwise been almost entirely lost. He had first met her, he said, when he was a boy, the Queen of Elfheim. She had come to his mother's house, and from that beginning, across 60 years of his life, they had been together. She appeared to him, taught him, was his companion, and in the plain language of his confession, his lover. He fathered children with her, he said. He saw them sometimes. They were not raised in the human world. He described her with a quiet reverence that no amount of interrogation seemed to dim. In his own words, as recorded by the court notary and preserved in the archives, the Queen is very pleasant and will be old and young when she pleases. She makes any king whom she pleases and lies with any she likes. She was changeable, she was powerful, she was to him entirely real. But she was not alone in the company he kept. There was another presence, a figure he called Crescende, who appeared variously as an angel dressed in white, as a great stag emerging from the snow, and as a companion of the Queen herself. Crescende told Andro things, showed him visions. This figure's name baffled Andro's interrogators and baffles scholars still. The most likely interpretation is that it is a corrupted or folk form of some older spirit of the Gallic world, neither quite Christian nor quite pagan, dwelling in the space between. And among the company of the fairy folk, Andro said, he had seen the dead. Not just any dead. He had seen James IV, the Scottish king who had died at the Battle of Flodden in 1513, 84 years before Andro's trial. The king had been at the fairy feasts. He had been there among the elves and the good neighbours, moving through the torchlit hall of the other world, more than 8 decades after his body had fallen on an English field. He had also seen Thomas the Rhymer, Thomas of Ayrshire, the prophet and seer, the man who had been taken to Elfland by the Queen 7 centuries before. You know his story. We have walked that ground together only recently. That Thomas still walked the fairy court was to Andro not a legend or a poem. It was a thing he had witnessed. Andro's description of the fairy feasts is vivid and consistent in ways that suggest something more than invention under duress. He described arriving at what seemed to be a great and well-furnished hall, with covered tables and music and dancing, and waking the next morning in a moss, an open boggy place, surrounded by the grass and straw that had apparently been the real appearance of all that splendour. The fairy world, even at its most hospitable, has a way of showing its true face in the morning light. His interrogators worked steadily to reframe everything he said. The Queen of Elfheim became, in their notation, the devil in the form of a woman. Chris Sunday became a satanic figure. The half-man, half-stag beings at the feasts became demons. Every element of Andro's rich and specific account of a world he had known for 60 years was systematically translated into the language of demonology. He was found guilty. He was executed in 1598. He was approximately 71 years old. His confession may be the only one from the entire Aberdeen panic to survive in its original form. Most of the others were deliberately destroyed, burned as the people themselves were burned, so that their stories might not unsettle the prevailing order. What remains of the Aberdeen witch panic is a series of chilling payments in the borough accounts: 20 pieces of peat, 4 tar barrels, a length of rope, and one old man's account of 60 years in the company of the Fairy Queen, recorded in a clerk's careful hand and kept against the odds until now. That same year, 1597, a book was published in Edinburgh. It was written by the King of Scotland himself, James VI, 21 years on the throne, a man of considerable intellectual ambition and very particular fears. The book was called Daemonologie, and in it, among its treatment of witches and necromancers and spirits of the dead, James turned his attention to the fairies. He was not kind to them. James dismissed the fairy folk not as real beings, but as deceptions. The people who claimed to have met the good neighbours, he wrote, had been eluded by the devil, who had taken on the appearance of these creatures in order to corrupt weak minds. Fairy belief, he said, was one of the illusions that had been most rife in the time of papistry, by which he meant the Catholic era. It was a superstition of the old church, of the ignorant centuries before the Reformation had brought proper theological understanding to Scotland. For James, there was no neutral supernatural territory. The world contained God and the devil, and nothing else of significance. Any spirit that was not clearly of God was by definition of the devil. The fairy folk, who belonged to no clear theological category, who were neither angels nor demons in any orthodox sense, who predated Christianity, who operated by older rules entirely, were impossible to accommodate in this framework. They had to be assimilated into it, and the only place for them in James's system was on the devil's side. This was not simply the opinion of one unusually zealous king. It became the operational theology of the Scottish witch trials. When a woman like Bessie Dunlop described meeting the good neighbours at a ford, the court heard meeting demons at a ford. When Alison Pearson described her dead uncle teaching her from within the fairy court, the court heard a demon in human form corrupting her soul. When Andro Man described 60 years with the Queen of Elfhame. The court heard 60 years of congress with the devil. The folk belief did not change. The legal and theological lens through which it was viewed changed entirely. There is a scholar worth mentioning here, though you already know his name, Robert Kirk of Aberfoyle, the minister whose life and extraordinary book we explored together not long ago, was, as the historian J.A. McCulloch observed, virtually alone in his age in taking a different view. Kirk regarded the fairy folk as real beings, neither divine nor demonic, belonging to a middle nature between humanity and the angels. He thought they deserved serious study, not condemnation. He wrote about them with curiosity and without fear. He died in 1692, the same year Andro Man was half a century in his grave. His contemporaries thought him eccentric at best, dangerous at worst. The tradition he belonged to, of taking the fairy world on its own terms, neither dismissing it nor demonising it, had almost nowhere left to stand in post-Reformation Scotland. What Daemonologie gave the courts was a complete theological framework for making fairy belief fatal. You did not need to have harmed anyone. You did not need to have cursed a neighbour or poisoned a well. You only needed to have accepted the gifts the Good Neighbours offered, because in accepting them, James's theology insisted, you had accepted the devil's gifts, and that was enough to burn for. 65 years after Andro Man was executed in Aberdeen on the 13th of April 1662, a woman in the parish of Aldern in Nairnshire walked into a room, sat down before a commission of ministers and local lairds, and began to confess. Her name was Isobel Gowdie. She was a cotter's wife. She could not read or write. She lived a few miles north of Nairn, in a low-lying landscape of fields and lochs, and the flat grey shimmer of the Moray Firth on clear days. Around her, barely visible on the horizon, lay a ring of ancient mounds, earthworks whose origins had been forgotten, whose purposes were no longer known, except in the folk belief of the area, where they had another name entirely. The Fairy Hills, the homes of the Good Neighbours, the doors into the other world. Isobel confessed 4 times over 6 weeks. Her confessions are the longest, most detailed, and most extraordinary documents in the entire history of Scottish witchcraft. They have been studied by scholars for 3.5 centuries, and they still resist full explanation. What is particularly striking, what has drawn historians back to them again and again, is that Isobel does not appear to have been severely tortured. The usual instruments of the witch trials, the boot, the thumbscrew, the witch's bridle, are not mentioned in the record. She came, it seems, and spoke. No one is certain why. Some scholars have suggested she may have suffered from a condition we would now recognise as psychosis. Others have proposed ergot poisoning, the mould that grows on damp rye, which when consumed can produce vivid hallucinations and mental disturbance. Others still, following the work of historian Emma Wilby, have suggested she may have been a practising storyteller, steeped in the folk belief of her region, to the point where the stories and the experience had become indistinguishable. She may have been confessing to things she genuinely believed. She may have been seeking, through confession, a strange kind of relief. We do not know. We cannot know. What we have is what she said. And what she said about the fairy folk is this. She had been to the Downy Hill. This is a real place, a large, cone-shaped mound that still stands in the flat farmland near Nairn, barely visible behind a thicket of trees from the main road, enormous and unmistakable when you find it. Isobel said she had gone down into a vast underground chamber within the hill, and there she had met the King and Queen of Elfheim. The Queen was dressed, she said, in fine white linen and brown and white clothes. The King was a well-favoured man with a broad face. There were great water bulls among the elves, terrifying creatures that frightened even Isobel, and more food than she could eat, though she suspected it would look like grass and straw by morning. She had also been given something to bring back, elf arrows, which we know from Robert Kirk's account and from a tradition stretched back to the earliest Anglo-Saxon medical texts. Small flint arrowheads, Neolithic in origin, which in the folk belief of Scotland were understood to be the weapons of the fairy host. Isobel described their manufacture in detail that is unlike anything else in the witch trial records. The devil, she said, shaped them with his own hands. Then small elf boys took them and sharpened them, talking all the while in rough, quick voices. When they were finished, they were distributed to the coven, to be flicked from the thumbnail at a target with deadly accuracy. She confessed to using them. She said she was responsible for at least 4 deaths in this way. The elf arrows were real objects. Archaeologists have found them. Neolithic flint arrowheads, sometimes still cupped in the leather pouches in which they had been stored, have turned up in Highland farmhouses from the 17th and 18th centuries, kept, the records suggest, not as curiosities, but as active magical objects. As late as 1884, a farmer in Buchan was heard mourning a dead stirk and saying it had been killed by elf shot. The folk belief persisted for 2 centuries after Isobel Gowdie was tried. What happened to Isobel is not certain. No execution record survives. Most historians following the evidence of how such cases usually concluded believe she was killed, strangled and burned most likely on Gallow Hill outside Nairn in the summer of 1662. But the certainty we have for Bessie Dunlop and Alison Pearson and Andro Man, the records that say, plainly, this person was executed on this date does not exist for Isobel. She vanishes from the records. The hills outside Nairn are still there. The Downy Hill still rises out of the flat ground, still half hidden behind its trees, still circled by the old ring of mounds that her neighbours called the Fairy Hills. Whether anything at all dwells there now is not a question I can answer, but Isobel Gowdie believed it did, and that belief, expressed openly and in extraordinary detail to a commission of the king's judges, was the last remarkable thing she ever did. We have spoken before about the Seelie and Unseelie courts. You know the broad shape of this territory, but tonight feels like the right time to go a little deeper, because the darker side of fairy belief in Scotland is not simply a moral contrast to the benign side. It is something older and stranger and more specific than that, and understanding it helps us understand why the authorities feared the fairy world so completely. The word Seelie comes from an old Scots word derived from the Anglo-Saxon, meaning happy, prosperous, blessed. The Seelie Whites were the fortunate ones, the pleasant ones, the good neighbours at their most benign. They might startle you, they might play tricks on you, might be deeply demanding of proper courtesy and respect, but they bore humans no fundamental ill will. Unseelie is the dark mirror, wretched, unhappy, unblessed. The poet William Dunbar, writing in the early 16th century, referred to Satan's unsole mean, his wretched troop of followers, a phrase that captures exactly the flavour of what the word meant in the minds of those who used it. It is worth being honest about something here. The clear division of the fairy world into two distinct courts, Seelie and Unseelie, good and evil, as neatly opposed as two sides of a coin, is more prominent in later tellings than in the majority of the original Highland and Island folklore collections. Most of the documented Scottish fairy lore comes from the Gaelic-speaking regions, where the framework tends to be more fluid and more specific. Individual creatures with their own characters, their own territories, their own rules, rather than a grand taxonomy of good and evil. The two-court model is a crisp distinction, is a feature more of the lowland and border traditions than the Highland ones. But what is absolutely consistent across all of the traditions and thoroughly documented in the folklore collections of the 19th and early 20th centuries is the existence of a class of fairy beings who need no provocation to do harm, who attack simply because a human is there, who take a specific, active pleasure in causing distress. These are the wicked wichts, the dark ones, the ones whose attentions no amount of courtesy or iron or rowan can reliably deflect, because they are not interested in a relationship with humanity. They are interested in its suffering. They move at night predominantly. They travel from the west, always from the west. That direction so weighted in Scottish belief with death and the other world. They assault travellers on dark roads, beat them, lift them into the air and carry them for miles, force them to commit acts they would never willingly choose. They press down upon sleepers. They drive cattle to stampede over cliff edges. They shoot the fairy arrows into beasts and sometimes into people, bringing sudden collapse and wasting illness that no physician can explain. The slua, which we have encountered before in these fireside evenings, belongs to this darker company, the host of the unblessed dead, who ride the night wind from the west, and for whom an unshuttered window is an open invitation. Their role overlaps with the Unseelie Court and the understanding of many who recorded these traditions. The dead who cannot rest, and the fairy folk who prey on the living, moving together through the same dark hours. What is striking when you sit with these descriptions is how physically immediate they are. This is not abstract evil. It is not theological. It is the weight on your chest in the night, the sound of something passing overhead that you cannot identify, the cow that was healthy at dusk and is dead at dawn with no wound on her and no illness anyone can name. The traveller found on the road at first light, bruised and shaking and unable to account for the hours since darkness fell. These were not stories about faraway things. They were stories about what might happen to you, specifically, if you walked the wrong road at the wrong time of night, or left the wrong window open, or failed to take the precautions your grandmother had told you to take. And here is the point where the fairy world and the witch trials touch again. When the kirk and the courts set about prosecuting fairy belief, it was not only the benign kind they were addressing. They knew or believed that the darker fairy powers were real and active and capable of destroying lives. James VI's Daemonologie describes in its careful theological language exactly these afflictions, the invisible shootings, the night oppressions, the violent abductions. He attributed them all to the devil's agency, but the folk who lived closest to these traditions would have said, no, this is not the devil at work. This is something else, something older, something that was here before the devil had a name. That distinction between demonic evil in the Christian sense and the older, stranger darkness of the unseelie world is exactly what the Reformation tried to erase. The Kirk needed everything to be explicable within its own framework. Two powers, God and devil, light and dark, salvation and damnation. The fairy world, with its moral ambiguity, its mixture of gift and danger, its ancient indifference to human theological categories, could not be permitted to exist on its own terms. And so it was conscripted. The Unseelie Court became, in the interrogator's notebooks, the devil's kindly face, the lure with which he attracted the unwary. The Unseelie Court became the devil's true nature, the violence beneath the charm. The fairy hills became the entrances to hell. The good neighbours were driven underground in a way that had nothing to do with folklore and everything to do with law. I want to sit with this for a moment before we move toward the fire and the closing of the night. When we talk about the Scottish witch trials, we tend to talk about them as a story of fear, of mass hysteria, of religious extremism, of the particular cruelty that organised power can direct at vulnerable people. All of that is true. None of it is wrong. The Scottish Witchcraft Act and the prosecutions it enabled were a catastrophe of injustice, and the 2,000 or more people who died under it deserve every effort we can make to remember them. But I think there is something else being lost that is worth naming, something that the numbers and the legal history don't quite capture. What was being destroyed alongside these individual lives was a way of understanding the world. The cunning folk, the fairy doctors, the healers who called on the good neighbours were not simply practitioners of medicine by another name. They were custodians of a relationship between the human world and the other world that had been tended and maintained and passed down through generations, through whispered instruction and careful practice, through the specific knowledge of which hills the good neighbours favoured, and which fords they crossed, and which words would open a door, and which would close one. That relationship was not always safe. The fairy world, as we have explored tonight and in other evenings by this fire, is not a gentle place. It contains the unseelie as surely as the seelie. It contains the danger of the fairy hill and the creatures who need no provocation to do harm. The people who maintained a working knowledge of that world were not innocents in a pastoral ideal. They were navigating something genuinely complex and genuinely dangerous with the tools that their tradition had given them. What the Reformation did was not simply ban magic. It banned the accumulated knowledge of how to live alongside the other world. It burned the people who carried that knowledge. It burned their reputations along with their bodies, so that the neighbours who had trusted them and consulted them and been helped by them had to either recant their own experience or risk the same fate. It made the fairy world unspeakable. We have a record of Andro Man because his confession survived by accident against the deliberate policy of destruction. We have a record of Bessie Dunlop and Alison Pearson because their trials were preserved in a legal archive. We have Isobel Gowdie's confessions because they were remarkable enough that copies were made. For every one of these, there are dozens, perhaps hundreds, of cases we know only by the payment records, 20 pieces of peat, 4 tar barrels, a length of rope, and the knowledge that those people carried, the names of the fairy hills, the words of the old charms, the precise geography of the boundaries between one world and another, went with them into the fire. Robert Kirk knew this was happening. He watched it happen. He wrote The Secret Commonwealth in 1691, partly as an act of preservation, trying to record what he knew of the fairy world before the last people who understood it were gone. He was, as scholars have noted, virtually alone in his era in doing so, and even his effort could not hold back what was being lost. He died the following year, and his book was not published until Walter Scott printed 100 copies a century after his death. The fairy world did not disappear, of course. It went quieter. It retreated further into the hills and the remote places and the Gaelic-speaking margins, where the new authorities had less reach. Belief in the good neighbours persisted in the Highlands and Islands well into the 19th century, and in some communities into the 20th. The story survived, the precaution survived, the iron, the rowan, the careful courtesy, the offerings left at the doorstep at night. But something was broken that has never fully been repaired. The confident, practical, everyday relationship between the healer and the fairy court, the thing that Bessie Dunlop and Alison Pearson and Andro Man had in common, that is gone. The person who could tell you from personal experience which words to speak at the fairy hill, who had been inside the other world and come back with something useful. That person stopped existing, not because the fairy folk withdrew, but because the price of knowing them became too high to pay. The fire is burning low now. Outside the window, the hawthorn blossom is white against the last of the May light, and the sky over the Firth of Forth has gone from plum to the deep blue of a starling's wing. The world is quietening around us. We have covered a long and difficult road tonight, from the world before 1560, when a woman could be a fairy doctor and a healer without fearing for her life, through the passing of the Act that changed everything, through the stories of Bessie Dunlop and Alison Pearson and Andro Man and Isobel Gowdie. 4 people whose names we can still say, whose stories we can still tell across the distance of 4 and 5 centuries. We have sat with King James and his Daemonologie, and with the theological machinery that turned the fairy hills into something monstrous. We have gone deeper into the Unseelie Court, the wicked wicts, the dark company, the older darkness that the Reformation tried to rename, and in renaming tried to own. And we have thought about what was lost when the last fairy doctors were taken away. These are not comfortable stories. I don't offer them as comfort exactly. I offer them as truth, or as close to truth as we can get, working from the records that survived and the scholarship that has tried to make sense of them. The people we talked about tonight were real. Their losses were real. The world they inhabited and that was taken from them was real. And yet, there is something in the persistence of it all that I find quietly astonishing. The story survived. The hills are still there. The old names are still there, if you know where to look. The fairy knoll, the fairy hill, the place where the water runs between two worlds. The precautions that grandmothers passed to grandchildren persisted long after the grandmothers who first taught them were gone. The good neighbours, whatever they are and wherever they dwell, outlasted the courts that tried to define them out of existence. Perhaps that is enough for tonight. Perhaps it is enough to know that these things endure, that the old knowledge, however battered and reduced and driven underground, does not entirely disappear, that a woman in Ayrshire in 1576 knew the name of the fairy man who taught her, and we still know it now, that an old healer from Rathvin remembered 60 years of a life lived in two worlds, and his words survived 4 centuries of deliberate destruction to reach us here by the fireside on a May night in Scotland. Let the fire settle now. Let the room grow still. The hawthorn is in bloom, and the year is turning toward its brightest point. And whatever else is true, you are warm and safe and resting. Sleep well, and if something moves at the edge of your dreams tonight, something quick and bright and not quite of this world, perhaps do not be afraid of it. Perhaps simply extend it a little courtesy. That, after all, is what the old ones always advised. If these stories have meant something to you tonight, a like and a subscribe helps more people find their way to this fireside. Thank you, as always, for being here. Good night from the fireside. Good night from Scotland. Good night.